Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, May 14th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the Army is testing whether rail networks can carry medical evacuation in modern warfare. Plus, what happens to the human body when missions become longer, more demanding, and harder to support from Earth? Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Defense Department is proposing a sweeping rule that would significantly expand the government's scrutiny of foreign ownership and influence across the defense industrial base, requiring tens of thousands of uncleared contractors to comply with security requirements historically applied only to companies handling classified information. For more, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Scott Freeling, co-chair of Covington's Government Contracts Practice, and Heather Finstuen, partner at Covington & Burling.
At a high level, the proposed DFARS rule extends the Department of Defense's foreign ownership control or influence review program to DoD contractors performing on unclassified contracts for the first time. And the background on this is that the proposed rule has been years in the making since the release of the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. So it's long anticipated, and the rule aligns generally with the U.S. government's trend of closely scrutinizing U.S. companies for foreign ownership and foreign involvement, where that foreign ownership and foreign involvement may present risks to U.S. national security, including in particular, in this case, for companies that participate in the defense industrial base. And I think the proposed rule can be viewed as part of an overall Department of Defense effort to secure the U.S. defense supply chain, both to protect against foreign access to sensitive but unclassified information and to protect DoD supply chains against the introduction or exploitation of vulnerabilities into products that the Department of Defense uses.
I would just jump in and say that the proposed rule, as Heather said, has been years in the making. The Congress set a deadline of July 1st of 2021 that it expected Department of Defense to issue this proposed rule, and it took quite some time for it to finally come out in May of 2026. The proposed rule largely tracks the statutory mandates that Congress set out in the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, implemented both the applicability thresholds of $5 million or greater on contracts and subcontracts, and it also implemented an expansion into commercial products and commercial sales if they meet a certain criteria set out in the statute.
I'd add one more thing. As Scott mentioned, the proposed rule implements the fiscal year 2020 NDAA. It also relates to a DoD instruction that was published in 2024. The DoD instruction is 5205.87, and it's called Mitigating Risks Related to Foreign Ownership, Control, or Influence for Covered DoD Contractors and Subcontractors. And that instruction establishes procedures that dovetail with the proposed rule. And so you have to read the proposed rule together with the DoD instruction.
So it's been a couple of years in the making. What's taken so long?
Good question. There's been a lot of speculation out there. I think while this is a simple requirement that Congress put out in the fiscal year 2020 NDAA, I think putting it into practice is a lot more challenging. And it's a big ask of the Department of Defense to implement a structure like that. The Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency has historically been focused on foci as it relates to companies that perform on classified contracts, cleared contractors. with this new mandate, it's going to sweep in a large swath of companies that serve the national defense, but do so without needing access to classified information. And those companies are now going to become subject to the disclosure obligations and the review and assessment process. And so I think part of the reason that it's taken so long is certainly the department has been trying to figure out how best to implement this and operationalize it in a way that works for their interests, but also the contractor community.
And just to follow up on that, what is it going to take the Defense Department to implement the rule?
So the Department of Defense, in the preamble to the rule, noted that they're just giving rough estimates based on some assumptions, but they expect that nearly 40,000 companies will be captured by the rule's requirements. And the rule now would require uncleared companies that are competing for unclassified DoD contracts to submit a broad set of disclosures relating to beneficial ownership and any other foreign touch points to DCSA for review as part of the contracting process. And so DCSA is going to be responsible for reviewing within set time frame tens of thousands of disclosures and making determinations about whether foci is present and making recommendations to other components of DoD on whether mitigation should be required as part of the award of an unclassified contract. DCSA is used to doing this in the classified space, but the scale is now going to be vastly expanded, and there's going to be new timing considerations because it's occurring in the context of a procurement process. And the DoD instruction provides a 25-day review period where DCSA makes that determination. And so DCSA is going to have to be ready to review vast quantities of information in a specific time frame that is embedded in a procurement process and make recommendations for mitigation and then oversee that mitigation. So it's going to be operating at a scale that it's never had to operate at before.
I would also say that it's not just on the department to change and operationalize this, but I think there's going to be many companies that have never attempted to fill out an SF-328, which is the standard form historically required of companies that are applying for or maintaining a facility security clearance to disclose their ownership and control and other structures. Now, a number of other contractors that haven't historically had to fill that out are now going to need to fill it out and provide information that, the burden's going to be on the contractor community just as much to gather the information and provide it to the department in a way that's going to be facilitative of the department's review. And so I do think there's going to be burden share across the board.
That's Scott Freeling, co-chair of Covington's Government Contracts Practice, and Heather Finstuen, partner at Covington & Burling, speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the Army is testing whether rail networks can carry medical evacuation in modern warfare. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Using Allied rail systems in Europe, the Army is testing how rail evacuation could expand medical capacity during large-scale conflict. Here with more details on what exactly they're testing in this exercise is Colonel Crystal Ballou, commander of the 519th Hospital Center. Colonel Ballou, it is so great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, man. It's a pleasure to be here.
You are coming to me from Germany, where the U.S. Army Europe is conducting Sword 26 exercises throughout the month of May. Before we get into what your particular role is here, give us an overview of what these exercises are, who's participating, what you're trying to test.
So the Sword 26 exercise is a series that demonstrates the Army's ability to operationalize the Army's transformation initiative. It's through the Eastern Flank Deterrence Initiative concept. It leverages in-theater forces to enhance deterrence and readiness. Specifically at the 519th Hospital Center, we're going to be working to modernize and innovate different levels of medical care and medical evacuation. We're going to be looking to do different types of innovative platforms, casualty staging, and we're going to be participating with different types of NATO allies and partners and different types of units across the theater wide. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that I think is really different about this is the Army has been practicing contingency operations really for the last 20 years, and this is back to large-scale combat operations. What sort of difference does that make in the work that you do through the 519th Hospital Center?
Yes, so we really need to start focusing on the size and scale of the complexity of the patients that we're going to be having. When we think of the previous COIN operations that we've been operating for a significant amount of time, we had been operating under what had been known as the golden hour, where we had air superiority. We were able to, under rotary wing, evac patients within a very short period of time to get them very rapid medical care. And we were able to maximize logistical and medical resources for those patients with very high successful survivability rates. And as we shift the thinking into large-scale combat operations where airspace is now contested, logistics are now contested, and we are expecting mass casualties, we really have to start innovating our training, modernizing, and our focus on how we're doing patient care and how we're doing evacuation. We have to start preparing to care in a prolonged standardization on the front lines. And we really need to start making sure that we're preparing our soldiers and we're supporting the maneuver forces and how we're clearing the battlefield as well.
Speaking of clearing the battlefield, one of the things you're going to be testing here is rail medical evacuation, something the Army hasn't done in Europe really since World War II. Why is rail evacuation back on the table now?
So two things, scale and efficiency. Trains allow us to move large numbers of patients over long distances in a single lift. This is something that ground and air assets alone cannot sustain in LISCO. They reduce the burden of high demand medevac platforms, and they provide a very reliable option when airspace is contested. In short, they give us the operational depth and flexibility that we're going to need in LISCO.
Is rail evacuation something that you can do anywhere, or is it really unique to operations in Europe?
When you look at the geography in the European theater and the lessons observed in recent conflicts, the rail network is a robust and high capacity lifeline. The medical evacuation train, or utilizing a standardized commercial rail for CASEVAC, allows us to move hundreds of patients in a single lift compared to a handful on a rotary wing aircraft. The rail network within the European theater is a common practice, something very experienced, and provides us a very wide, broad opportunity to also move into a more NATO interoperability dimension as well.
I'm speaking with Colonel Crystal Ballou. She's commander of the Army's 519th Hospital Center in the 21st Theater Support Command. So, Colonel Ballou, when you think about bringing people out of the theater on rail, what levels of injuries might you be able to transport in this way?
So in this current exercise, we're going to be testing the capabilities of the specific rail platform that we're going to be utilizing in this theater. So more minimal, more ambulatory patients to see how our capabilities can collaborate and coordinate with our NATO allies, But in the future, what the goal would be to outfit these trains to serve as rolling hospitals. They wouldn't be to just move patients. The goal would be to actively provide en route care. The innovation itself isn't just the train, but it's basically a modular life support system that we could plug into standard rail cars. Now, again, this would be the long-term goal, and we're starting at the ground level of where we could experiment and innovate with these platforms. You could do anything from isolate intensive care compartments. You could establish mobile surgical suites. You could move massive volumes of patients from the immediate combat zone to higher echelons of care, all while bypassing that contested airspace. That would be the goal.
That sounds really ambitious. Is that concept in development, the equipment, the practices, all of those kinds of things?
That would be a difficult question for me to ask. I know within the Medical Center of Excellence in San Antonio, Texas, they are actively looking and researching into what the future of that may be. And not something that necessarily that we're looking at developing within the 519th Hospital Center. So we are going to be testing specifically, like I said, the minimal kind of ambulatory patients, but definitely, as you stated, a very ambitious goal that would be the long-term hopes as a provider myself that I would like to see a rail evacuation platform to move to.
Well, let's come back to this exercise itself. You're hoping to move about 250 casualties, stabilized casualties who need higher level care. What are the particular learning objectives that you're trying to test here, and how will you know if you've been successful?
So we've established at the 519th Hospital Center, we've established two key tasks in this very innovative training that we're working to get after. The first is to test and develop that concept for the medical treatment and evacuation. Although we're not aiming to get after specific patient outcomes in this specific training, we are trying to gain lessons learned, and again, evaluating those minimum patients, how we are loading them to the train, the time that it takes, the staging that it requires, the power capabilities, the medical equipment that's required, the personnel support that it requires. So looking a lot more of kind of the logistical aspects behind it. And then the other part to that would be the developing and testing the concept for the casualty staging unit. And with that, that's a piece of doctrine for us that does not exist and is more of a concept for Army medicine. Now, that is a concept that is actively utilized by our NATO partners that we are going to be testing within this specific exercise. And we are driving the concept of looking at what type of medical capabilities that would require, what type of personnel resources we want to put towards it. And so, again, a lot of lessons learned we're going to be using in this innovation. And so our goals, our training objectives are pretty broad for this specific operation. So we can that way we can pull our different lessons learned and then continue to streamline how we want to move forward in refining these different innovations and concepts.
And again, this exercise is happening in Europe, but if you look beyond at the exercise, are there other scenarios, regions, conflicts, types of operations where rail evacuation might become a realistic or even a necessary option for military medicine?
I do see this as a necessary option for military medicine. It would be difficult to say which geographic regions that it could be relevant and fall to. One example that comes to mind of a very high visibility region would be the Indo-Pacific, where obviously rail evacuation would not be relevant. But that is a region where contested airspace is of concern, contested logistics are of concern. But how would evacuation work in that type of region over such broad geographic space where, again, airspace is contested? So I think with the concept of rail evacuation and the capabilities that it offers, the amount of casualties that it can move in a single lift, I think are of criticality for Army medicine. And I think where the next conflict could take us would determine the relevancy of that type of evacuation platform.
I've been speaking with Colonel Crystal Ballou. She's commander of the Army's 519th Hospital Center, 21st Theater Support Command. Colonel Ballou, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, ma'am.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, as federal missions grow more complex, technology transfer is getting a credential meant to sustain expertise and credibility over time. But first, what happens to the human body when space missions become longer, more demanding, and harder to support from Earth? You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A joint effort bringing together Navy medicine, the Air Force Research Laboratory, NASA, and academic researchers is reshaping how the government studies human performance under changing gravity. The focus is building durable capability for longer, more demanding missions. My guests are Rich Folga and Dr. Michael Schubert. Dr. Schubert is professor in the ENT department at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and Mr. Folga is Aerospace Medical Research Device Program Manager, Naval Aerospace Medical Research Laboratory. Dr. Schubert, Mr. Folga, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us. We're glad to be here.
I'm really interested in this conversation because certainly space exploration is on the mind of the public. We've got the Project Hail Mary movie in theaters. We just saw Artemis II astronauts on a highly successful mission. You all have been working in this science space for years. What are the biggest human performance challenges associated with long distance or long-term space flight?
Yeah, the greatest challenges are related to the duration spent in space impairs our ability to walk, particularly if we need to exit the spacecraft urgently. So if you've followed NASA and the space program recently, and it has been exciting, you're absolutely right, Terry. What you will notice is when the crew are taken out of the capsule, they need some assistance walking. And so NASA and the greater science community is concerned that if the vehicle were to land in a position on Mars or some future space location, that they would have difficulty getting out of the capsule safely. So ability to walk, ability to perceive the environment, ability to see clearly when they land, all related to, in part, integration of the balance system that we have in our heads, one in each ear. And that balance system, when it's exposed to microgravity, conditions of reduced gravity for a long period of time, sort of has to reorient what it does. It's no longer needed to detect gravity. And so that leads to some problems when they are then reintroduced to a gravitational field.
So this research that you all are doing now is trying to get after that, and it's got a very interesting approach. It brings together Navy medicine, Air Force Research Laboratory, NASA, and academic partners like Johns Hopkins, kind of all centered at Wright-Patterson. Mr. Folga, what's the value of having all of this integrated at that one spot?
Well, first of all, the combination of the human centrifuge and the Kraken device, which is our research device that we can use for any type of motion application with large fields of view. The two devices are extremely complementary, and there's only one other location in the world that has that sort of complementary co-located capability. And so from a U.S. perspective, this is a really unique opportunity. Our lab here moved from Pensacola. The Air Force's equivalent lab moved from San Antonio during base realignment and closure. And now we've got this combined campus of all these aeromedical experts here. So when a question like this comes up, our devices can be used to help answer those questions. And then in this particular case, the original plan was to use the Kraken, but we found that the centrifuge was a better application, a better system to execute the protocol. And so we're using the Air Force's centrifuge, but the Navy and Hopkins were teamed originally. And so we kept that teaming and moved the project over there. But that's the wonderfulness of this location, is we were able to quickly flex, use our partnerships, and move the experiment over there where it's been being conducted successfully ever since.
Dr. Schubert, let me come back to you. Describe the nature of this study. It's obviously getting after the human balance issues that you talked about, but how does a centrifuge play into that, and what are you actually looking to test?
Yeah, the centrifuge is the best analog on Earth that we have to replicate as close as possible what the crew members experience when they return from long duration space travel. They are disoriented, their balance is off, and the way that we do that is we put them in a centrifuge, and they're positioned in a certain way that after 1 hour of being centrifuged in that position, and it's interesting, Terry, actually when they are during the centrifugation, they feel okay generally. There's not a lot of motion sickness during it. Some of them have it. But when they egress the vehicle, when they get out of that centrifuge, that's when they appreciate that their balance is not very good. They don't feel as good when they move their head. And that's the best analog we have to what the crew member experiences. What the study is designed to do is measure a self-automated rehab device and its ability to treat the effects of motion sickness once you've been exposed to it. So the design is to test people before and after centrifugation on various gait tasks and various perceptual tasks and various eye movement tasks that are all functions of the balance system, which we call the vestibular system. And then there's an intervention where half of the subjects will do this rehab intervention and half of them will not perform any intervention, which is sort of the current standard of care for motion sickness. On Earth, when we get motion sickness, we find a dark room, we turn out the lights, we don't move. And so that is kind of the standard of care. So we're comparing a movement-related rehab device that's self-automated versus that no movement condition, and measuring the effects of that on those outcomes that have been measured that I've specified.
Mr. Folga, I'm imagining my time on carnival rides when I think about centrifuge. Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
It is. It is. So if you've got a long arm and the capsule's at the end of that arm, and like Michael said, we position them in a way to get the acceleration forces just right, and then they're spinning. So when you watch the device, it doesn't look like it's moving very fast, but we're actually achieving 3 times the force of gravity. And that gravitational vector is kind of pushed kind of into them through their chest. So it's got a front to back force. And they're sort of laying back with their knees sort of above their chest level, if you can imagine, feet first into the turn. So it's basically, driving in this very large circle, and they're being kind of pushed into their seat. And so you feel like you weigh 3 times as much as you do, or if somebody's sitting on your chest essentially the whole time. And then once you kind of adapt to that, you're basically in that position without moving for an hour. And that's our goal, is to get them to spin for a full hour. It's not super comfortable. As Michael said, there's going to be some discomfort with that. You have alterations of blood flow, and you have, different things we try to accommodate for, cradling their head and lumbar support, because all that stuff starts to get messed up when you push somebody like that for that long of a period of time. And most folks aren't adapted to that. So it is kind of a strange carnival ride. But you can think of those rides at the whether it's the carnival or at an amusement park, where they put you against the wall and they centrifuge you and spin it, and it pins you against the wall. It's sort of the same thing as that. Just imagine doing it feet first.
For an hour.
For an hour. That's right.
It's a long ride. So most of the time you're in line that long, not in the ride.
That's right.
I'm speaking with Dr. Michael Schubert. He's a professor in the ENT department at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And Mr. Rich Folga is an Aerospace Medical Research Device Program Manager at the Naval Aerospace Medical Research Laboratory. Dr. Schubert, let me come back to you, because you're the designer of this study. Its applications are obvious for space missions, but might it be extended as you get through it to other applications for human performance here on Earth in other conditions?
Absolutely, Terry. The device is also being measured in patients on Earth that have had a surgery to remove a benign growth that occurs on their balance nerve. So similar design, we're measuring the ability of the device to improve the same outcome measures, balance and gait, walking and eye movement control, compared to the standard of care for rehab in a civilian population. The unfortunate reality is, on Earth, there are not a lot of experts to manage vestibular disorders And so we believe that if we can create an automated device that people can have access to in rural areas in particular, or areas that just don't have the medical expertise, that this can help quite a bit. So there's certainly an Earth application as well for developing this technology.
Mr. Fogel, let me come back to you because you all are soliciting participations for this carnival ride. If we can go back to that metaphor, what are you looking for in the participants and what risks might they incur?
So what we're looking for are folks, because the centrifuge is an Air Force asset, we need to have folks that have TRICARE medical coverage. So that's one of the requirements to participate in studies that we do on our campus here using our military apparatus. And then what we're looking for are folks that, in this particular case, we need to make sure there's some level of screening that they can perform the duty and the tasks. And so our general kind of ticket to ride also involves an air medical clearance notice. So it's basically similar to what an airman or a private pilot would have for their FAA medical clearance. And so that gives us some assurance that those folks are fit enough to be able to do the tasks that we need them to do. And so if you've got those two things, then you're eligible. And so that's usually who we're looking for. So it tends to be military populations that are volunteering because we're on a military base. And if they happen to be in a flight status, then they'll have an air medical clearance notice. So that's our target population, or somebody that can get that clearance notice as well from a aviation medical examiner or provider.
Any concerns about balancing the risks to individual participants with the scientific value of the study?
Yes. So, of course, anytime you put somebody in an apparatus like this, they'll consider it to be greater than minimal risk. And so the Institutional Review Board will look at that, and they'll look at all our risk mitigation criteria and what the possible outcomes can be. But generally speaking, as Michael addressed, the thing we're trying to induce is motion sickness. And for the most part, it's really a pretty common thing. And so whether you go fishing or you're on a bumpy airplane ride, it's really the kind of thing that folks encounter every day or could encounter every day. And so we're screening folks, obviously, to meet the medical and the aeromedical kind of clearance level, but we're also asking them about their normal susceptibility to these things. And so we're trying to find folks that are sort of in that mid-range of they have a mild susceptibility to motion sickness. And so they would be a good candidate because we want them to feel the effects. We don't want somebody that's a zealot that can ride in a roller coaster 100 times in a row and then they get out and feel nothing. It's like, well, we're probably not going to have that same effect because we're trying to use folks that are good astronaut analogs as well, because that's your immediate transition here is back to NASA for space flight. So we're looking for folks that kind of fit that mold, the age range, population range, and then kind of the medical makeup as well. So by doing that, we feel like we're mitigating most of our risks, and the devices and our safety procedures are very well rehearsed, and the devices are generally very, very safe. And so as far as risk goes, the population is not really going to see a lot of that. But anytime you're making somebody ill, there's a chance that maybe afterwards it would take them a while before, let's say, they're ready to drive home. So we want to accommodate for that and make sure folks are aware of that.
Are you getting a good response to the call for volunteers?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, the fact that Artemis 2 launched and came back and it was such a success has been a wonderful recruiting thing for us. So yes, we've been getting a great response. And in fact, there's somebody in the centrifuge next door to me right now doing this exact spin. So we've got a Marine Corps volunteer, Marine Corps pilot who's volunteered to come over and do that and is in the centrifuge as we speak. So that's really exciting, doing this study. And so we don't know if they're in the treatment condition or not. I don't know that, but I can tell you that they're spinning for science as we speak. So it's very exciting. And we only need a handful more folks, and then we'll be fully booked.
Spinning for Science sounds like a great new program.
We do a bit of that.
Dr. Schubert, let me come back to you. Let's assume that your study here is successful. What happens next? What's the next stage of research in human performance that you would like to see undertaken?
Well, there's a lot related to the device. First of all, it's just sort of the commercial development. It's always a big leap to move science from the lab out to the public. So this is equipment. It's fairly technically involved. It does need to be iterated upon. So that would be one step, would be just to commercially develop some of this stuff, to get it into the hands of other people at broader numbers to actually validate it in that way. The other next step that would be good to do is to see if we can we treat folks beforehand. Remember, in this design, we are inducing the dizziness, as Rich said, and then applying the intervention. Might be nice to look at, I think it would be nice to look at an intervention during, when they're traveling to get to their destination, really, and NASA's really focused, as you know, on the moon and then Mars. The distance to the moon is relatively short, so we don't have to worry so much about motion sickness for there. But for Mars, it's much longer. So can we intervene during the trip? So what studies could we design where we prevent or we significantly reduce the effects of the long duration space travel during the travel? Can you do rehab during the trip so that when you get there, you can get out of the vehicle and be fine and not have to do a post-trip intervention? I think those designs would be useful.
I've been speaking with Dr. Michael Schubert. He's a professor in the Ear, Nose, and Throat Department at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and Rich Folga, Aerospace Medical Research Device Program Manager at the Naval Aerospace Medical Research Laboratory. Thank you both so much for joining me and for sharing this fascinating research with us.
Thank you, Terry. It was my honor. I'm glad to be here.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, as federal missions grow more complex, technology transfer is getting a credential meant to sustain expertise and credibility over time. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Federal Laboratory Consortium has introduced a professional designation designed to strengthen how federal labs move research into real-world use by building recognized, transferable expertise. The goal is to create a clearer marker of credibility for agency leaders, industry partners, and the workforce itself. My guest is Andy Myers, Technology Transfer Lead at the Kansas City National Security Campus. Mr. Myers, it's so great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation. Glad to be here.
We often talk about tech transfer as a business process, things that move from one stage of development to another. Tech transfer really requires people behind the scenes to do that. The Federal Laboratory Consortium has just created a new professional credential for these folks. Tell us about the problem you were trying to solve when you decided that a formal professional designation was needed.
Well, to start with, the idea about tech transfer, the U.S. government has made really significant investments in the research and technology that advances not only science in general, but areas for our country to be leaders in. From the Manhattan Project till today, the government has invested billions into research at universities, national labs, small businesses, etc. The government gives us the right to own intellectual property for anything that we develop under those research projects, but also prevents us, any federal entity, that from being a commercial competitor with U.S. industry. The goal is really to help U.S. industry grow. And so we need to take those inventions, those patents, that intellectual property, and move it into the public sphere. And that doesn't happen automatically. People don't just go to a website and say, what technology should I look at today? There are a huge cadre of professionals looking at market analysis, at industry trends, evaluating the intellectual property that has taken place at the federal lab level, and trying to make connections with also, individuals at companies that might value those inventions. And so there are lots of parts to that puzzle, lots of different people involved, and lots of knowledge that all of those individuals need to get. As you would expect, the federal sphere is not like any other. And so people need to understand what the rules and laws and directives are, agency to agency, and be able to communicate those amongst their peers as well as to industry in general that we're trying to work with.
You've just described a really complex environment, sort of the intersection of science and law and acquisition and partnerships. So from your experience, what finally pushed this work from being seen as a role people maybe grow into from job to job toward a profession with defined standards?
I think it's a couple of things. One is kind of critical mass. We've been doing this since the 80s when federal legislation appeared that gave universities and then federal labs the right to own intellectual property and to be the stewards of those resources. And over a couple of decades, we have found best practices. We have found lots of missteps that we need to correct. And all of that together leads to a code of conduct, a list of rules, understanding of how we should operate within this framework.
I'm speaking with Andy Myers. He's the technology transfer lead at the Kansas City National Security Campus operated by Honeywell. Andy, who benefits the most from this kind of professional signal? Is it the labs themselves? Is it the industry partners? Is it the workforce? How do you see this credential changing the nature of the conversations between all the players?
I think it begins with the employees that are working in federal tech transfer offices. Some of those are contractors, like in the Department of Energy, and some NIH labs. Others are federal employees. And tech transfer is not necessarily an area where people go to study at a university. And so we learn the techniques and we learn the language and we learn the laws on the job. And so having a professional designation helps us with our training, helps us identify gaps in understanding, and creates, a more well-rounded tech transfer professional. That then goes on to benefit all the parts that participate after that, working with other federal agencies, working with industry, being able to explain why rules are the way they are, and really kind of emphasizing the benefit to working with us and licensing intellectual property from the federal government.
There are other career fields that have credentials. I'm thinking acquisition professionals, financial management professionals. When you think about adding this into the tech transfer workforce, what might you expect to be the long-term implications for the workforce at large? Will this entice more people into the specialty? Will it help them stay longer? What are you hoping to accomplish with the credential?
I think a little bit of all of those. When you look at similar credentials in our industry that focus on licensing or tech transfer in an academic environment, those are all designed to raise the level of professionalism and, again, helping everybody look forward together. And so this happens in a federal perspective, and our view is just enough different that we didn't think that we could rely purely on other designations. And so we're hoping that as we, again, get some critical mass in people that have the pro designation, we elevate federal tech transfer, elevate the individuals carrying it out, hopefully that helps them with their professional progression as individuals, and just raises, I guess, both awareness and activity in the field.
One of the challenges of having a program like this is not only setting the standards, but managing the testing and the credentialing, keeping the standards up to date, ensuring that everyone agrees that these are the right standards. How is the Federal Laboratory Consortium going to manage the program?
So the program wasn't launched without an executive committee that will evaluate applications or without the list of requirements that are necessary to get this. The FLC has had a longstanding history of training, of engagement, of meetings that bring professionals together. And we've been able to use that network and those resources to build the base for both the requirements and the evaluation of those. So we have a list of experienced professionals that we identified early and reached out to and have joined us in evaluating new applicants. Our plan is to do this on a quarterly basis. The applications are not burdensome, but you have to have been in the federal tech transfer world. So working at a federal tech transfer position, having attended an FLC meeting, participated in training. And so all of those are, we were clear about trying to make those easy to accomplish, but purposeful.
The application window for the first cohort is open now. What do folks need to know and where do they need to go if they're interested in applying?
The easiest place to find information is at the FLC website. That's federallabs.org. Our national meeting is coming up May 13th and 14th. And if, attending a national meeting is one of the requirements. And so if you can join us in Seattle, we'd love to see you. The website will give information about the program. It will have information on the requirements, and it will have resources, email addresses of where to send that information and where to send questions.
And then let's just talk long term. What is the vision for this program 5-10 years from now?
Just as the profession grows and evolves, we hope that the pro designation will as well. There are things today that weren't anticipated when some of the federal legislation came on the scene in the 80s. I suspect we will continue to see that. And so as we get the first cohorts going and start to use this as a designation, I think we'll see ways that we can refine the program. Maybe there will be subsets that lead into specific areas such as marketing or contracts or some of the legal areas around IP ownership. I think we're, open to seeing how it grows and best benefits our members.
I've been speaking with Andy Myers. He's the technology transfer lead at the Kansas City National Security Campus operated by Honeywell. Mr. Myers, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's grant processes are about to get a little more transparent. That's because a new law requires FEMA to publish a dashboard of public assistance claims stemming from federal disasters. That requirement comes as the administration and Congress consider broader reforms to FEMA. And for more details, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now. Justin, great to have you.
Good to be with you, Terry.
What is this requirement to develop a new dashboard?
Yeah, this requirement was slid into the 2026 Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill that just, of course, was signed into law at the end of April, ending that big, long DHS shutdown. And so this requirement actually mirrors a bill that was introduced by Senators Ashley Moody and Angela Alsobrooks in December. So kind of got fast-tracked into this bill compared to other legislative provisions that are often put out there. And this would require FEMA to post an interactive dashboard on its website that tracks all requests for reimbursement under the agency's public assistance program. Now, the PA program is what the grants that FEMA provides to states to reimburse them for costs incurred from a federally declared disaster. These could be things like debris removal, search and rescue teams, medical supplies, all the way through to those longer-term projects like rebuilding roads, utility repairs, and more. The PA program is separate from the individual assistance program where FEMA provides assistance to individuals to help rebuild their houses and provide housing in the aftermath of a disaster. So it's separate. But it's very important to state and local officials to know where these projects are at. And a lot of times they don't really know where they go once they enter the system. That's according to Brett Mattson, who's the senior legislative director at the National Association of Counties.
The process is county submits public assistance claims to the state submits it to the FEMA region, and then we as the county are sort of left sometimes in the dark about where those claims stand. And so then we'll either reach out to the state, and the state will say it's at the FEMA region. We'll reach out to the FEMA region. They'll say it's at the state. So it's kind of this finger pointing game and trying to figure out where the actual PA claims stand.
So, Justin, how would this dashboard address some of the concerns that Mr. Mattson raises there in terms of finger pointing and not really knowing the status of these programs?
Yeah, the requirement for the dashboard is very detailed in terms of what should be involved in it. The bill would require the dashboard to include information on each reimbursement request, including the status of FEMA's review, the project level progress, as well as any other information that the FEMA administrator determines to be appropriate to ensure transparency and accountability. The law would require these reimbursement requests to be posted no more than 90 days after FEMA initially receives them, as well as within 60 days of a project entering final review at DHS, so it has to be continually updated. And so this would provide that really granular level detail into the process that I think a lot of, as you heard, counties and local governments are missing right now.
How would these kinds of changes connect to some of the broader reforms that are being recommended for FEMA right now?
Well, the FEMA Review Council just posted its final report, and it also includes a call for increasing public trust through transparency and accountability at FEMA. And actually, if you look at the public comments that the FEMA Review Council solicited last year, some groups specifically called for this type of dashboard. The American Hospital Association comes to mind because one big issue that cropped up within the last few years is FEMA was providing public assistance reimbursements for COVID-19 costs, and there ended up being a big bottleneck of those claims over the last couple of years. You've seen lawmakers writing FEMA furiously over the last year or two about where do these claims stand. I think Senator John Fetterman just had a letter to FEMA last week, and this has just been an ongoing thing. And so groups have been calling for just more information about where these claims stand in the process for a while. And now it's actually in law. And then you have the FEMA Review Council report, which includes that overarching call for transparency. That's where also Congress could step in with the Fixing Emergency Management for Americans Act, the FEMA Act, which has been working its way through the House.
What other provisions are in that pending legislation?
Yeah, it's interesting. This dashboard requirement is actually an early preview of the FEMA Act because it's in this big bill already. So I guess if it does pass, FEMA might be able to check that one off the box early. The bill includes a whole slew of other things, though. There's a whole section on transparency and accountability. It would require, multiple GAO reviews of things like disaster assistance fraud, potential cost savings associated with repair work. It would require federal agencies to publish information through a new website about disaster assistance funding and activities, kind of project by project, just on the funding aspect of things to provide that funding kind of transparency. And then in addition to the public assistance dashboard, the bill would require FEMA to do an individual assistance dashboard so that individuals can track their claims when they're trying to rebuild their houses or things like that. So this bill, again, is just in front of the full House right now, has 70 plus co-sponsors. It's bipartisan. So it will be interesting to see if it can move this year in an election year.
Well, coming back to the public assistance dashboard, now that they have the requirement, what are the next steps?
Well, there isn't any sort of deadline in the law for FEMA to finalize and publish this dashboard, so it seems like they have some wiggle room. I reached out to FEMA, and on background, a FEMA official told me that they didn't have any updates to provide at this time, but that once things move along and plans kind of develop, we're only 2 weeks out from this requirement being passed into law, once things develop, they will have more to share on the dashboard. Mattson from the National Association of Counties talked a little bit about how he's expecting just everything swirling around FEMA with the FEMA Review Council report, the FEMA Act, to just help push things like this dashboard along at the agency.
I think we'll start to see some action here soon on a number of things from the agency. So we're obviously, in contact with FEMA about what that process is looking like and sort of what their timeline for rollout is. And we'll obviously be pushing them to get this out sooner rather than later, especially as we head into hurricane season. We know that that's obviously going to be a very busy time. Obviously last year was not, but it'd be hard pressed to say that we're going to have that luck 2 years in a row.
And one thing I didn't mention is, FEMA is still coming out of a difficult time when it comes to losing a lot of personnel, going through a record-long government shutdown. So it'll be interesting to see kind of behind the scenes how the program management around things like this dashboard work, how they can kind of pull things together given everything else that's on their plate.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for bringing us the story.
Absolutely. Thank you, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.